Well, that's why I think, and I'm not trying to bash in any way the applicant, but I think that's why it was important to me that you read that chronology, because the length of this process is not something that I will take this whole responsibility for, because things like the water plan falling through and the suspending of the process while the applicant put together a new plan, or things like bringing in the Indian tribe, or things like agreeing to delay while a FERC decision was argued and ultimately made, are things that happened in the last few years. They weren't things that this board had control over. When there's no water supply plan, there's no ability to run a facility of this kind. So giving the applicant the opportunity to put together another plan and suspending this process, I think was the right thing to do in terms of their opportunity to make their case. But I think it is not fair to conclude that that means that this board prolonged the process, because so many of those things were not only out of our control, but were the request of the applicant. So I think that's an important point, because one of the reasons that hindsight's 20, not that hindsight's 20/20, but one of the reasons so many things have happened during this process is because of how long it took. And one of the reasons that it took so long was because of the way it was handled.
Yes, I agree. And that is not to cast aspersions on the applicant. I think that it's clear that it was not intentional on the applicant's part to hold things up. Being on the PUC, concerns about regulatory lag are fairly consistent. And yes, that does happen, but I think the board has been criticized, and I'm not talking about any criticism from the parties. I'm not aware that they have ever said anything about that. But there has been, I think, perhaps just a general assumption made by people who are not involved in this process that this is taking an incredibly long time, so it must be the board's fault. And it hasn't been. I think that we should at least get the credit for having kept it moving along as well as it could, given a number of things that came up that the parties acknowledged made it imperative that we pause. And we could escape those criticisms perhaps if we just made them go forward, notwithstanding the issues that they themselves had indicated. But I think that I agree it was the appropriate thing to do, so that the applicant had the opportunity and the opposing parties had the opportunity to make the case that they wanted to make, so that we have ended up with a record before us that allows us, I think, to make well-grounded findings and determinations as we're required to under the Act.
I think one of the things that happened, and it happened from both sides, was that because so many things were happening external to this, despite the rules on the pre-file testimony, we kept having new, I've got a pile of reports and documents, new exhibits, and I don't think each side made an issue of it, but in both cases it was new information that was relevant to this process that came after the deadline for the pre-file testimony, so I thought it was by and large helpful.
Absolutely. I think it was appropriate that we had that relevant information to consider in our determinations.
I would also add to this discussion, although obviously a little bit later to the table on this, going back through all the records, listening to, in particular, reading through and listening to the reiteration of the timeline was helpful for me as well, because it really put into context a lot of things that I had been seeing all throughout the discussion, and taking a look at the full record of evidence. So stopping this process somewhere along the line because not everything had been provided, giving that opportunity, I think, was definitely the right thing to do. I think it was very important for us to give that, that opportunity for the full level of testimony to be presented. But even, through the spring, we received a number of different reports. The amount of things that we had to read and look at and file, and sometimes overnight. I know we've had some arguments on that, but I think all of that, even the things we received that were short notice that we had to read overnight, also added to the level of information that we had available to us and helped to make a better decision.
So that's, if you want to add any thoughts on, that's really kind of concludes my articulation of my thinking that was developed over a period of many months.
Thank you. That's impressive. And we are getting very close to when we said we would break for lunch. And I think before, it would be appropriate, unless anybody here has an objection, to break now.
I wasn't expecting that. I'm fine with that for an hour.
Yes.
Let's say one.
Sorry?
Give everybody a time.
Right. Whoops, sorry. So the time currently is 11:53, so we want to be back here no later than 12:53.